The first human the Zarnathi ever captured alive was a man named Paxton Merrick. He wasn't a soldier, not exactly. He was a recon technician stationed on Vesta Outpost 7, orbiting the mining colony on Ceres, and he'd been caught during a nocturnal sweep wrong place, wrong time, with a half boot on and a protein bar halfway to his mouth when the stun beam knocked him cold. Commander Kale of the Zarnathi Strike Division studied the unconscious form laid out across the sterile metal table. The human was tall for its species, lean-muscled, skin marked with small scars from old injuries. Kale watched the monitors as the human's vitals began to climb back to waking levels. "We assume pain is their limiter," said Kale through his translator node. "They fold under pressure. This one will tell us everything." The other Zarnathi in the room, Vox, a field interrogator, nodded. "They are fragile, easily swayed by discomfort." "That is what the Terran Confederacy files suggest." Kale leaned forward as Paxton stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked at the harsh overhead lights, then groaned, attempting to sit up. His hands were bound to the table. "Right," Paxton muttered, voice hoarse. "Not a dream." Kale stepped into his view. "You are in custody. You will provide information regarding your military's deployment around the asteroid belts." Paxton squinted at him. "I build sensors. You want military secrets, you bagged the wrong guy," Kale gestured to Vox. A flat metal rod no thicker than a pen was pressed to Paxton's arm. A pulse of energy snapped through his nerves. His body arched involuntarily, teeth gritted. He gasped, his jaw tight as he rode out the jolt. "That felt like licking a plug socket," Paxton hissed through his teeth. "You got anything stronger?" Kale narrowed his eyes. "You will tell us what we need. You will not endure this much longer." Paxton's breathing was ragged, but he barked out a laugh. "Buddy, I once shattered my ankle during a training drop and still crawled 3 miles back to base." "You're gonna have to do better than a tickle stick." Kale flicked a glance at Vox. "Increase intensity." The device made a high-pitched whine, then discharged again. Paxton's muscles spasmed, but this time he screamed a short, guttural sound that ended in a cough. Sweat rolled down his forehead. Kale leaned closer. "You cannot resist this. Your mind will break." Paxton coughed again, then looked up, eyes bloodshot. "Yeah," he whispered. "Maybe, but not today." For 2 rotations, the interrogations continued. Paxton gave them nothing useful. He asked questions instead about their ship, about their food, about which part of his brain the shock rod was targeting. He sang songs they didn't understand and told long-winded stories from Earth about things called bears and hot sauce. He joked with the guards. He vomited once after a particularly strong jolt, but apologized for the mess. On the 3rd rotation, Kale authorized a different approach. They transferred Paxton to a simulated environment chamber, a fabricated jungle world meant to simulate Earth terrain. The idea was to observe human responses under extended isolation and physical hardship. They released him inside the biodome with only a canteen, a knife, and a single ration bar. Surveillance drones buzzed overhead, silent observers. Paxton didn't panic. He explored. He tested the artificial trees, plucked leaves, sniffed at the synthetic flowers. He built a lean-to with sticks and vines, muttering the whole time about the weird lack of mosquitoes, and made a game of catching the small lizard like surveillance probes. By the 5th day, Kale noted Paxton had started talking to the plants. He named one of the drones Cheddar. He taught it how to play fetch using pebbles on day 8, while scaling a rock face in pursuit of a falling ration wrapper. Paxton slipped. The cameras caught the moment his foot twisted beneath him, the snapping sound of bone unmistakable. He tumbled 7 feet, landing hard against the artificial ground. He screamed once, then clutched his leg, curling in on himself. Kale leaned in toward the monitor. Pause movement. Observe response. Paxton lay there for several minutes, panting, sweat glistening on his brow. Then he started to laugh, short, sharp bursts that echoed through the dome. "Oh God," he gasped. "That's broken. That's definitely broken. I've done that before. Yep, clean snap." "Fantastic." He kept laughing even as he dragged himself back toward his lean-to, face pale and jaw clenched. He tore apart his shirt to bind a makeshift splint around the leg, mumbling through the pain. "Cheddar, buddy," he said to the hovering drone. "You got a medkit in there, no?" "Figures?" Kale turned to Vox. "He is injured. That laugh, was it hysteria?" "No, it was amusement, from pain, apparently." Kale stared back at the monitor. "This cannot be normal." The next day, they sent in medical drones to confirm. The leg was broken tibia fracture, mid-shaft, swollen and discolored. Paxton allowed the drones to scan but refused sedation. "Had worse," he said through gritted teeth as the auto cast sealed around his leg. "Once fell off a snowmobile into a frozen creek, got hypothermia and a cracked rib." "This is just a Tuesday." Kale reviewed the footage 3 times. "Perhaps he is anomalous," he concluded. Vox hesitated. "He should not be. We selected him at random." They began testing the theory. The Zarnathi captured 2 more humans in separate operations, both soldiers. One, a pilot named Ramos, screamed through a dislocated shoulder. The other, a demolitions expert named Kaya, passed out during a simulated drowning test. Neither laughed. Kale returned to Paxton's cell. The human was sitting up with his casted leg propped on a crate. He was drawing something on the wall with a piece of broken plastic. "Explain your reaction," Kale said. "To what? Your injury?" Paxton shrugged. "What, the leg? Yeah, that sucked, but I've had worse. Laughing helps, distracts from the pain." "Your body was damaged." "You found that amusing?" Paxton tilted his head. "I found it ridiculous. Slipped on a food wrapper, broke my leg. That's comedy, man, like slapstick. You ever seen slapstick?" Kale didn't answer. Paxton gestured to the wall. "I'm drawing a comic strip about it." "You guys ever get into cartoons?" Kale left without responding. Back at command, he filed a report. "Human tolerance for pain is non-linear and inconsistent. Emotional responses are unpredictable. Further study required." Even so, Kale couldn't forget the sound of that laughter echoing through the simulated jungle. It wasn't madness, it wasn't defiance, it was something else entirely. By the time Paxton's leg had healed a full 6 weeks later, with regular scans and physical therapy administered by the Zarnathi drones, Kale had reassigned 3 officers just for monitoring him. None could explain why the human, in the face of suffering, refused to behave as expected. And then, one night, Paxton escaped. He used a piece of shrapnel from a broken drone to short the lock on his habitat chamber. Limping, still favoring his healing leg, he made it 40 meters before the security bots caught him. He fought harder than expected, even injured and required sedation to subdue. As they dragged him back, he laughed again. "Worth it," he wheezed. "Bet Cheddar didn't see that coming." Kale watched the footage in silence. One of his science officers stepped beside him. "Perhaps pain is not an effective deterrent for their kind," the scientist suggested. Kale shook his head. "It is, but it is also something else to them, a challenge, a story, a joke." He stared at the screen as Paxton was wheeled back into confinement. "And I do not yet understand why." 3 weeks after the failed escape, Paxton Merrick was relocated to a new section of the vessel, Observation Deck G5, colloquially referred to among the Zarnathi crew as the vivarium. It was a controlled environment, not unlike the previous biodome, but with a notable difference: it had windows. Floor-to-ceiling panes of impact-resistant synthoglass offered a panoramic view of the asteroid field they currently drifted through. The Zarnathi intended it as a psychological pressure test. Humans, they theorized, might respond with disorientation or dread when exposed to the vast, indifferent emptiness of space. Paxton had other plans. "Not to alarm anyone," he said, pacing along the length of the window with a slight limp, "but one of those asteroids looks like a giant potato. I mean, look at it. Right there. Big Idaho energy." 2 observing Zarnathi technicians exchanged glances behind the wall of one-way mesh. The elder of the 2, Specialist Dren, adjusted the focus on the data stream recording Paxton's neural activity. Stimulus has not induced the anticipated existential reaction, said Dren. No signs of disassociation. Cortisol levels remain baseline. He is naming celestial bodies after root vegetables, said the younger technician Have. Is that a human coping mechanism? Possibly, Dren replied. Or he is simply unbalanced. Inside the room, Paxton had already moved on to other pursuits. He'd found the seam in the wall paneling near the filtration vent and was wedging a length of synthetic cable liberated from the control interface of an old maintenance drone into the gap. "You know what your problem is, Cheddar?" he said to the hovering drone that had resumed its silent vigil. "You've got trust issues. I try to escape once, and suddenly you're all cold shoulders and passive-aggressive beeping." The drone blinked its indicator lights in a non-patterned sequence. It had been reprogrammed twice since Paxton's last attempt to co-opt its systems, but there was still something about the way it hovered slightly closer than required, never quite turning away, that suggested it was paying attention. As Paxton worked, the door hissed open. "Don't mind me," said a new voice, female, accented, unfamiliar. He turned. A human woman stood in the doorway, flanked by two Zarnathi guards. Her jumpsuit bore no insignia, no rank. Her left arm was in a sling. "Well, this is unexpected," Paxton said. "You with catering?" She stepped into the room, ignoring the guards. "Dr. Lena Korrin, civilian researcher. They nabbed me off the Europa survey team 12 days ago. Paxton Merrick," he said, offering a small wave. "Resident escape artist and asteroid art critic." Lena didn't laugh. Her eyes swept the room, noting the tools tucked under the bench, the jury-rigged antenna angled toward the ceiling, the scuff marks near the vent. "You've been busy," she said. "Idle hands and all that. What's with the arm?" "Compound fracture," she said bluntly. "They tried to reset it with a surgical drone. It didn't go great." He gestured toward a crate. "Sit, I'll take a look." She hesitated. "I've got basic field trauma certification," he said. "Not much else to do around here." She sat. He peeled back the sling and examined the swelling at her elbow. She didn't flinch as he palpated the area. "Radius is off alignment," he said. "You should be in a full immobilizer, not a sling. They don't know the difference." "I do." He stood, rummaged through a drawer, and returned with a length of molded foam, some adhesive strips, and a metal brace pulled from a drone casing. In 10 minutes, he'd splinted her arm properly. "That should keep the joint from grinding every time you move," he said. "Thanks," she said. "Didn't expect a medic." "Not a medic," he said. "Just tired of watching people suffer because these guys think we're made of glass." Lena leaned back. "They're studying us, you know, testing thresholds. Isolation, injury, food deprivation. Probably trying to figure out why we don't break the way they expect." "Yeah," said Paxton. "It's almost insulting." Later that cycle, Paxton pried open a floor panel and pulled out a length of fiber optic wiring. Lena helped, holding the light steady as he worked. "Where'd you learn this stuff?" she asked. "Grew up on Mars. Power systems fail a lot out there. You learn fast or you freeze. You miss it." He didn't answer for a long moment. "I miss gravity that doesn't lie to you," he said eventually. "And coffee. Real coffee. Not the synth slurry they serve in orbit." By the time the lights dimmed for rest cycle, they'd rerouted power from the environmental console to a disconnected comms grid. It wouldn't transmit off ship, but Paxton figured it could reach another part of the vessel. The next phase of their plan required movement. At the next nutrient cycle, Paxton deliberately spilled the contents of his tray across the floor, then slipped as he bent to clean it up. The guards rushed in. While one tried to hoist him upright, Lena stepped behind the other and slipped the reprogrammed power cell from his belt. They were back in isolation before he noticed it missing. The following rest cycle, they used it to power the internal relay. "We've got about 20 minutes before the Sishik flags the reroute," said Paxton. "Just enough time," said Lena. She plugged in a keyboard made from scavenged panel buttons and began typing commands. "Where'd you learn to spoof Zarnathi operating systems?" "Did a postdoc in comparative linguistics. Turns out their code syntax is built on context chaining. Once you break the sequence logic, it's pretty intuitive. He stared at her. What? I was gonna say I admired your commitment to being terrifyingly competent. A few minutes later, the screen lit up with a schematic of the ship. Paxton leaned over her shoulder. Okay, he said. That's us, vivarium, that corridor leads to the hangar. What's that chamber? Cryo storage, she said. Looks like 20 pods, human, he tapped the screen. They've got more. Maybe survivors from other raids. We need to wake them. We can't, she said. The pods are networked. If we open one, the system flags all of them. We'd trigger a full lockdown. He pointed to a node labeled Subsea's Path 9. What if we reroute the alert through the simulation chamber's diagnostic relay, cause a false hardware fault? She blinked. I think that might work. They set the override. The system accepted the change without protest, then the screen went dark. Power cut off, said Paxton. They noticed. The door to the vivarium hissed open. This time it wasn't guards. Commander Kale entered, flanked by Vox and 2 technicians. You have accessed restricted systems, said Kale. Was checking the thermostat, Paxton replied. Gets chilly at night. Kale stepped forward. You will cease all unauthorized activities. Continued defiance will result in neural inhibition. Do you think we don't know what that means? Said Lena. We're not lab rats. Incorrect, said Kale. You are variables. You're scared, said Paxton. Kale tilted his head. Explain. You keep testing us. Pain, isolation, deprivation. But it's not about what we can't handle. It's about what we do when we survive it. You are unpredictable. That's what scares you. Kale turned to Vox. They spoke briefly in their own language, too fast for the translator to catch. Then Kale looked back. You are to be separated, he said. 2 guards entered and seized Lena. She struggled, but one pressed a neural suppressor to her neck. Her body went limp. Hey, Paxton shouted, lunging forward. A guard intercepted him, slamming him back against the wall. His shoulder cracked against the paneling. Kale stepped closer. You will remain here, alone. Your actions will determine your suitability for long-term analysis. As they dragged Lena out, she locked eyes with Paxton. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. The door sealed behind her. He slumped to the floor, clutching his shoulder. The pain was sharp, immediate. He breathed through it. Then he stood. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. Instead, he walked to the console and began rerouting the power again. The lights in the vivarium flickered back on its second cycle. Paxton had already torn out the comm relay's casing and was elbow-deep in bundled wires, rethreading a twisted copper filament through the dead node with the edge of a broken drone blade. His right shoulder throbbed from where he'd slammed into the wall. The joint had popped out of socket, and he'd had to wedge it back in himself using a ventilation grill and his own body weight. His arm was weak now, range limited but usable. The panel sparked. He yanked his hand back, shaking it. Okay, he muttered. Don't like being reversed. Noted. Paxton glanced at the surveillance drone hovering in the corner. Cheddar's lens blinked blue, then green, then blue again. He ignored it. 3 hours later, he'd bridged the relay to the atmospheric regulator's diagnostic port. It wasn't communication, but it gave him access to the ship's internal status logs. No visual feeds, no control override, but he could see power consumption spikes, chamber seal logs, access protocols. It was enough. He spotted it then, a cycle anomaly in chamber Delta 9. Not Lena's new location, but the cryo storage bay. Someone was manually rerouting power every rest phase, just like he had. He tapped the panel. I see you, he whispered. By third cycle, Paxton had mapped the ship's internal ventilation schema using heat drift patterns from the waste processor logs. There was a maintenance shaft running just beneath the vivarium floor, sealed except during sanitation cycles. The hatch wasn't large, but he could squeeze through if he dislocated his bad shoulder again. He didn't hesitate. He wedged himself under the bench, braced his foot against the sidewall, and pulled. The joint cracked loose with a wet pop. Lights burst behind his eyes. He bit down on the fabric of his jumpsuit and let the pain ride out. Then he reached for the panel and pulled it free. The shaft beneath smelled of burnt coolant and stale metal. He lowered himself in one-handed, using his knees to guide the descent, 40 meters. 2 turns. 1 vertical drop. He barely landed on his feet, his leg twinged but held. The corridor outside the shaft was narrow, lined with silent conduits and cooling cables. No guards, no drones. He moved fast, favoring the injured side, ducking beneath sensors and slipping through emergency crawlways until he reached the interface hatch for Chamber Delta 9. The panel outside the cryo room was sealed with a biometric lock. He pried it open with a salvaged tool and rewired the circuit to fake an internal override request from the environmental controller. It clicked open. Inside, rows of cryopods lined the walls, each lit from beneath with a soft violet glow. 20 in total. 19 occupied. The 20th was open, and Lena stood in front of it, elbow deep in the internal wiring, hair tied back with a strip of her jumpsuit. "I figured it was you rerouting the power," she said without looking up. "You always had a subtle touch. You're supposed to be locked up. They put me in a science lab after I wouldn't stop asking about their data structure. I think they thought I'd bore myself to death." He stepped closer. "What are you doing?" waking them, quietly. "The pods are all networked, but if you isolate each one manually from the central interface, you can boot them up sequentially without triggering the alarm." "How many have you done?" 3. "So far so good, you want to help," he nodded. They worked in silence, disabling the alert nodes and bypassing the thermal sensors. Paxton's hands were steadier than expected, even with the shoulder still half dead. His fingers bled from stripped wires, but he didn't stop. 6 pods in, one of the occupants stirred a woman, mid-30s, shaved scalp, emergency medical tattoo on her neck. "Lieutenant Sierra D," she murmured groggily. "Fleet Med Corps," Lena steadied her. "We're not enemies. You were abducted. We're getting you out." By the 8th pod, they had 3 soldiers, 2 engineers, and a shipboard AI tech-conscious and alert enough to follow directions. Paxton handed out makeshift weapons, pipe wrenches, sharpened scrap, anything metal with heft. They moved fast. Paxton led them through the same back corridors he'd mapped earlier, bypassing automated locks and timed security loops. Lena coordinated the evac from the rear, keeping track of who was conscious, who needed support. The AI tech mason patched into the nav array using a stolen data stick and located the escape vessels. 2 emergency dropships docked beneath the main hangar, unguarded. "That's our ride," Paxton said. They reached the hangar by the next cycle. Only 1 guard bot stood between them and the ships. Paxton dropped it with a repulsor wrench to the optic array while Mason jammed the security feed with a looped static burst. They split into 2 teams, 1 dropship per group. Lena took command of the first with the injured and unconscious. Paxton led the second, powering up the engines manually. "Flight controls are familiar," he called over his shoulder. "This is basically a mining shuttle with a fancy hat." Mason took the co-pilot's seat. "Any idea what's waiting outside?" Vacuum and regret. The launch clamps disengaged. They fired the thrusters. Behind them, alarms lit up. Zarnathi Command had noticed 3 interceptors lifted off from the upper bay. Sleek, quiet, fast, Paxton grimaced. "We've got company." "Can't outrun them," Mason said. "No, but I can improvise." Paxton rerouted power from the forward deflectors to the exhaust manifold, overloading the vent arrays. The ship jolted, then shot forward in a controlled burn that lit the surrounding field. "What are you doing?" Mason shouted. "Creating a distraction." The flare blinded the Zarnathi sensors. The first interceptor veered off course. Paxton toggled the emergency beacon to transmit on all civilian bands. "Broadcasting now," he said. "If anyone's listening, come say hi." The second dropship followed in formation. Lena's voice crackled over the short range. "Your engine's burning too hot." "It's fine," he said. It wasn't. The warning lights flared red. Coolant pressure maxed out. The console blared. Mason grabbed his arm. "We have to dump heat." "Not yet." The third interceptor came in fast. Paxton yanked the manual override and cut all power, engines, lights, everything. The ship went dark. The interceptor overshot, unable to lock on. Mason blinked. "You just played dead. Learned it from an opossum documentary." He rebooted systems. The dropships drifted into the shadow of a passing asteroid. The Zarnathi ships looped once, scanning, then retreated. A moment later, a Terran cruiser blinked into real space, drawn by the emergency beacon. Mason exhaled. "We made it." The cruiser hailed them. Lena's ship responded first. "We've got 19 survivors," she reported. "And one lunatic with a wrench." Paxton leaned back. "Best Tuesday I've had in weeks." Back aboard the cruiser, the survivors were checked, scanned, and debriefed. Paxton's shoulder was reset under analgesic gas. The med techs winced when they saw the bruising. "You should be unconscious," one of them murmured. "Had worse," he replied. "Just don't touch the rib. I think it's arguing with my lung." Lena found him later in the recovery bay, arm in a sling, chest wrapped. "You broke protocol, probably half a dozen treaties, and violated at least 3 laws of thermodynamics." "Yeah," he said, "but I got you out." She sat beside him. "You did." They didn't speak for a while. Later, during the formal report, the Terran Defense Committee asked how he'd managed to survive so long. Paxton scratched the back of his neck. "I fixed things. I broke other things. I waited, and when the time came, I did what humans always do. Which is," he grinned, lopsided and tired, "adapt, improvise, and make friends with the surveillance drone." The committee didn't laugh, but they wrote it down. Back on Earth, Paxton disappeared into a debriefing center in the Andes. Lena returned to Europa Station with a new research directive. Understand alien behavioral analysis, and maybe teach them a thing or two about resilience. As for Cheddar, the drone, it was last seen floating in a Terran tech lab, being taught how to play fetch with a tennis ball.